to order. Sorry for the delay. We were changing some computer technology tonight. We'll start off with a roll call, please, Brittany.
Bob Ackerman.
Here.
Stephanie Sutton.
Here.
Christian Newman.
Here.
Thomas Hawkins is absent. James Bly.
Here.
Jason Hurst.
Here.
And Sophia Corrigetto is absent.
Thank you. Do I have a motion to adopt the agenda this evening?
I move to adopt the agenda.
Okay, Mr. Newman, is there a second?
Second.
Mr. Hurst, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. Next, do I have a motion to approve the minutes from last month's meeting?
I move to approve the minutes from the last meeting.
Okay, thank you. A second?
Second.
Mr. Hurst? Okay, all of those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Okay, great. Ms. McMullen, can you read the announcement into the record, please?
Yes. Section 30-3.3 of the Land Development Code establishes the Plan Board, including its membership, rules of procedure and functions, powers, and duties. The Plan Board is advisory to the City Commission on most planning petitions. Appeals of Plan Board decisions concerning special use permits are to a hearing officer within 30 calendar days of the decision. See Section 30-3.58C of the Land Development Code. The procedures for an appeal are set forth in Section 30-3.58.
Thank you. Are there any requests tonight to address the board on items that are not on our agenda this evening? Anyone here?
And we do have Adam on the line as well for public comment.
Okay, and if there's anyone on the phone lines?
Madam Chair, there's nobody on the phone lines at this time. Thank you for asking.
Okay, thank you. Then we will move on to old business. Can you read the first item into the record?
Petition PB-20-160 TCH, City of Gainesville, amend the Land Development Code to modify building frontage, building entrance, and building material requirements for properties in transect zones. And I'm going to pull up the presentation. We don't have to go through the entire thing in detail, but just to remind you about what we're looking at tonight. So you originally heard this item back in January. This is an item that is on the code amendments list. Some issues that were identified by the Plan Board and the City Commission back in 2019. So this is one of those code update items. And we have combined building frontage, building entrance, and building material changes into this one text change. So just briefly, that's what this text change addresses: frontage, ground floor active uses, entrances, and materials. Last time we talked about changing the building frontage standards for single-family homes. In addition to allowing outdoor seating areas to count towards building frontage requirements. We further defined ground floor active uses, and we added some language about building materials. Another thing that we did was to further define primary public entrances to provide direct access when ground floor uses are present. And we have added some additional language since that January meeting, and we did a few other updates that I'm going to go through with you based on the conversation at that meeting. But one thing that's been brought up a lot lately by the Commission and the Plan Board is the concern about vacant storefronts, in new buildings, particularly like multi-story, multi-use buildings that are getting constructed with commercial uses on the ground floor, not seeing tenants filling those spaces. So we figured that this, oh, you know what? I just realized I'm not sharing my screen. That is not helpful. Sorry about that.
I was following.
Okay.
We were following in the staff report.
Okay, good. Okay, so we did propose to add this language to the building form standard section about requiring basically developers to build out those ground floor units. Um, so So the language reads, in order to improve the leasability of ground floor commercial spaces, the developer shall be responsible for the provision of mechanical, electrical, plumbing, and fire protection services to meet the functional requirements of future tenants, including accommodations for restaurant tenants by providing in-ground grease traps and adequate rated chases for future exhaust hoods in the original building infrastructure. So that is new language that we're talking about tonight, so we definitely want your feedback on that. And we're hoping that this may address some of the concerns that have been brought up around that issue. And so now I want to just show you the actual text so we can take a look at what we updated based on our prior conversation. So one thing that we changed, we already talked about the active ground floor uses and the build out requirement. Some specific changes in the building materials requirements. There was a concern expressed about the primary and accent building materials potentially not allowing for glass walls. So we did add in that 100% glass walls may be acceptable. There was another comment about the accent building materials and restricting those on the first level of multi-story buildings. So the language originally read that accent building materials, specifically EFIS, may not be used on the base level of a building. However, we did add in some language to specify that that would be applicable to multi-story buildings and not single-story buildings. And then we added an additional attempt at some language to require that building materials be maintained, and that is partially in relation to the EFIS, but also just other materials that may need maintaining over time. So specifications would be required to be provided as part of the building permit package, as well as a maintenance schedule. And I believe those are the major specific changes that we made. I don't know if Andrew had anything else to add on that.
I would just wanted to thank Member Blythe for meeting with us and kind of talking about some of this and listening to I think some of the points that he raised that we tried to incorporate into the draft. On the ground floor commercial spaces and that part of the code language, I spoke with the city building official and our chief plans examiner about this issue and sort of where they saw, based on the projects that we have coming in to the city, like where there's been challenges with taking some of those shell spaces and building those out with future tenants. And one of the main, I think one of the main things that they felt would be additive to this change would be including this language so that that developers, when they're sort of building the actual building itself and the project, are making sure that they're doing everything that they can with some of those basic systems and putting those things in place so that they're basically lowering the barrier to the tenant to come in. Well, one of the things that they had raised was with one of the commercial spaces on the ground floor of the continuum. In this case, is the coffee shop donut location. There was a significant cost that was borne by the tenant to put in an in-ground grease trap and to provide exhaust ventilation that wasn't contemplated initially with the build out. In this case, there was a corporate tenant, who obviously had resources to expend, but I think part of the conversation in the community with the commission, with the plan board, has been how do we lower the barrier of entry to local businesses? This is one way we do that, by trying to shift the cost of some of those basic tenant build out elements that aren't sort of building out the space in a certain way that they may not know exactly who the tenant is, but that they're upfront when it's under construction, putting in those basic systems in place that are not going to then be yet another barrier for that tenant when they're doing the tenant build out. So we feel pretty good about this language. I think it sort of tries to strike a balance between what I think is really kind of intended to achieve the goal that we've heard, but also not necessarily be so prescriptive that we're sort of stipulating, okay, this is where a restaurant tenant is going to be, this is where a general mercantile tenant is going to be, because oftentimes, like with projects, they don't always know up front, but we want to make sure that those spaces are set up in a flexible way to accommodate those tenants in the future.
So one piece of feedback I have on that is if you have ever tried to permit a grease trap, which I have, they require pretty detailed information about the type of equipment that's going to be in that kitchen so that they can size the grease trap accordingly. So it's not as easy as you think to just put a grease trap in the ground. You won't just get a permit from GRU saying, hey, we're going to have a restaurant here someday. They're going to want to know, what kind of restaurant and what kind of equipment are they going to have? And so it's not as easy as you think to do that. It's going to require some coordination with GRU to figure out, what is the standard size that we want to equip these with, and have GRU provide more flexibility in their review of designs, because that's definitely going to come up. They don't just let you put a grease trap in the ground not knowing what's going into it or what kind of restaurant and how many spaces. And sometimes, you could always put two smaller ones, and some, it may end up being two small restaurants, or you could put them in line for a bigger restaurant or something, but they just aren't crazy about that at GRU. So I'm hesitant to leave it as is, because I know it's not as easy to do that as you think it should be. It's definitely a consideration that should be made, especially in bigger buildings that have a lot of retail space, where you imagine at least one restaurant's going to come in, but not knowing if it's going to be one or three makes it difficult as well. So, I'm hesitant to the intent is there, and I agree with it. I think we need to watch the wording a little bit, because it just may not be possible. They need to plan for it, and maybe spaces over a certain size, you require it. If it's over a certain number of thousands of square feet, you just assume there's going to be a restaurant in this somewhere if it's 10,000 square feet. I don't know, and I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah. And I would just to respond before you go. That was the same feedback that I got. I spoke with a few local builders who do mixed use projects here in town, and typically they're the ones they're the type who bring in the ground floor tenants with the building. They're already kind of designing it, and that's been our experience with the local. Developers typically are building those spaces out with the development. They may not build it out immediately, but they usually have a tenant, who's coming behind them pretty quickly. It's more of the large out of town outfits that are building the space, and the residential makes their pro forma. But that was the same feedback that I heard, was GRU needing to be more flexible and not necessarily requiring a 5,000 gallon tank for because that obviously is an expense, but also probably more importantly it's a space consideration, because those take up so much room. So I guess I'm not sure if I have a great answer outside of like that's feedback that I heard, and that's something that we were going to need to work out on the city side, on the nuts and bolts side. I don't know if there's anything in code language that we could kind of consider to maybe help sort of move that conversation along. But we're certainly open to that. But it was an identified issue, and I think it's partially what we're trying to strike the balance between, in terms of setting things up and making sure they're thought about on the front end, but not getting so specific that we're like setting something in place that would need to be pulled out, for a future tenant.
We do have some lights, but I'm just going to follow up on that one more time, because even so, I'm thinking of a particular development, actually not in the city, but even when you try to put grease traps in ahead of time, I've also had to go back and change the sizes and add grease traps because you've ended up with a lot more restaurants than you thought were going to be in a certain space. And so you put 2 in proactively and you end up needing 4. And so you're still going back to the drawing board to some degree. So maybe it's a matter of designating spaces for future grease traps and noting that and sort of having areas that meet the access requirements. But I'm also open. I think James may have some ideas on that too. So
Yes,
Bob, you were first.
I have no doubt that you and James have better comments about this. My issue, though, seems to be, at least, and I could be naive, but when I drive by and I see a 10-story building, my assumption is it's going to be there for more than 10 years. And so over the period of 40, 50, 100 years that it's going to be there, I'm guessing the tenants will change. And so we need to come up with some system that either makes the responsibility of building this critical infrastructure the owner's onus, because the idea that we're going to spec it out on the day it was built and then we're going to be that way for the next 100 years doesn't make any sense to me. We don't have any idea. Right now, it appears that most of our tenants are going to be restaurants. It just seems, small-scale retail is, except for a few categories, is not really doing well and probably will not for the foreseeable future. And that even applies to what I would call office tenants, insurance companies, insurance brokers, all those, they're all going away too. So it seems to me if we're going to make this reasonable for the onus is going to have to be on the owner to be able to adjust when the time comes. Either that, there has to be, I think, some penalty for just saying, I'm just going to leave it empty. I don't really care about this. All I want to do is have students upstairs. And that appears to be what a lot of our developers are doing right now. And we end up with just a bunch of empty space, and that kind of kills the promise of mixed use if the developer just ignores one part of the thing that allowed them to build this 8-story building. Anyway, that's what I think.
Yeah, I agree. And so I want to, compliment you guys. This is a really important item for the city. And I don't think that there's a really easy way to accomplish it, but I think if we're talking about the hurdles that the civil and the design team kind of goes through, we can tell you some things. So number one, there has to be this, idea of the space for them. That you can't, it's unrealistic to design something without the space where they will go. So that's number one. So whether that's we figure out what the largest grease trap size is, and there's got to be that rectangle that shows up on a civil document where it can go. But then from there, we're talking about inverts and the way that everything is leaving the building. You have to make sure that that is, in essence, kind of designed into the system. So I think that would be a requirement, that it would be designed to be able to work, and that maybe if there's some way of, it's almost like, what Stephanie said is right. You don't want to have to rip out a grease trap either, and that was happening at Celebration Point and some other places where restaurants are moving around, and we had to find the closest grease trap, and it turns out that this grease trap is too small, and this one is like way too big. So I don't think that helps either. It almost seems to me like if the developer of the project had to put X amount of dollars into like, not like a trust, but something where until there's a restaurant tour or somebody that needs the grease trap, they don't have to put it in, but they've already had to put in, you know, kind of like an escrow amount of money, that when that tenant comes in, you know, maybe there's an application where that tenant can get that money, you know, to cover that cost. Because again, I would be worried that if we just said, hey, you have to put in the biggest grease trap possible, that's going to start really adding up. And then just making sure that there's some kind of plan where it shows, you know, if the building is 100 feet long, you don't really want to put the grease trap probably on one side of it, because then it's unrealistic to, you know, to make a run to that. So some sort of logistical plan that would be mostly on the civil site, you know, development team. But for building infrastructure, we do want to make sure that we've got some sort of piping that is put in, most likely, so that they're not having to tear up a lot of public infrastructure potentially. So just stubbed up either conduit or piping. And then I wanted to say it still feels a little vague on the MEP, you know, fire, what's in there. And I don't know if there's a way to potentially outline that may give this a little more teeth. You know, a specific example would be if you have an empty suite and you have a building electrical room somewhere, logically you have to be able to get from the suite back to the building electrical room. So maybe it's a specific thing like putting in requirements to go from building core elements to each suite with empty, whether it's conduit or infrastructure, something that is like an actual path towards getting that tenant what they need. Because one of the things that we find is that if you're not the first tenant in, there's usually somebody in the way of you and those resources. So putting that in to where, you know, if I'm the second tenant in, now I have to spend extra money to get to that thing that now would have been easier had it been stubbed. So I think if item 7 could just be, that's tough because you don't want to overly prescribe it, but it feels like it's on the way there, but it's still like a little bit too full of loopholes to not get us there yet.
Yeah, I think the other challenge with it is that some of that, you know, the grease traps sort of need to be laid out by the civil at the site plan stage. But a lot of it really is going to come through in the building permit stage. And so it's not clear here, like at what point are we requiring what? And I think, you know, I agree with sort of the vagueness. And I do think, you know, and I mentioned like maybe per X number of square feet, you have to have, you know, every 5,000 square feet, you have to have a grease trap or something. So if you've got 30,000 square feet, you've got to have 6 grease traps or whatever. And maybe there is a metric like that that makes sense. That's totally just off the top of my head. I mean, I'm not saying that's what it should be. But I also want to be hesitant to like not be that specific, right? So like the Celebration Point example, you know, Spurrier's is one restaurant, but it's huge. And it has 3 grease traps. So, you know, depending on how things are laid out, you know, even the biggest grease trap may not be big enough. And if you end up getting 2 small restaurants next to each other, you know, you're going to need 2 small grease traps. So I think allocating the space, and maybe it's a certain allocation of space per square footage. And I hate for this to get that specific, but I think that we do need some specificity here. And I also think calling out what's required at site plan and what's going to be required at building permit is important, because you just can't demonstrate all of this in site plans.
Right.
So, you know, and if we're going to start requiring, you know, all of the mechanical and fire protection plans to be submitted with the civil plans, I mean, people are going to freak out.
Yeah, and I don't think
We already require a lot of MEP information. And, you know, people just don't want to be at that stage of building design yet when they're doing the civil plans. So I think I think we're headed in the right direction. It just needs a little bit more work.
Yeah. No, I think that's super good feedback. And I was thinking about some of the examples, you know, where that we had that are maybe not like, there's probably good examples in Cautionary Tale where we had like the review when we were in building permit stage for the standard. We had this the site plan had this beautiful courtyard, interior courtyard that was intended to be for people to recreate and walk their dogs and this and that and the other. Midway through building permit, there was additional tenant leases signed for restaurant spaces. Suddenly, it went from 2 or 3 grease traps to 5 or 6 grease traps, and so they had to find space for those because there was not an interior chase that was exhaust chase that was designed with the initial plans. The sort of compromised exhaust ended up exhausting a lot of the for the restaurant tenants sort of out of the lower scale interior building out into the courtyard area. So on a hot day, if you really like Chick-fil-A, you can go out there and probably smell it because it's those are the things that I think to everybody's points is where we're trying to get to. I like the idea of being more specific about things that are like that we feel like are real impediments, and like putting in conduit and dedicating space. I do think that maybe the space sort of dedication may be a positive sort of incentive for if you're having to set it from a developer standpoint, if you're having to already set the space aside and for a future potential grease trap, then there may be more of an impetus to like, okay, well, I'm gonna have to set the space aside. Maybe I'll go ahead and take the extra step and just find a tenant and put that in up front than just have basically empty space in that. But I think those are good comments. I think what depending on sort of the pleasure of the board, like we can, if there are more comments about this item, like we can go back and maybe have another conversation with some of our building folks and maybe see if we can, maybe loop you in, James, if you're willing to give up a little bit more time, and we can come back with some language for this item that I think tries to get it, because I do think we're on the right track, and I do think it's an important positive step in trying to address some of the concerns we've heard. So anyway, so that's it.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if this is all related. I know we've been talking about just item 7, but I definitely have, notes for the
Other
rest of it. So if it would be
comments,
better to discuss that later or now, I'm happy either way.
We're happy to talk about it now, and then I think it's good to get everybody's sort of feedback on
Yeah.
that.
That'd be good. Okay. Was there anything else on 7 before we talk about anything else?
Do better.
Yeah, I think it's good. Well, it just goes to saying like, hey, plan ahead to be successful. Plan ahead to fill this, and what challenges are you going to have? That one was the most forward thinking of all the items. Yeah, I probably would just start in if that's okay.
Yep, go ahead.
Let's see. So item 4, I guess it would be under front. No, I guess it's under its own category here.
That
The
bring
outdoor
on the
seating.
outdoor seating.
Yes.
Mhm.
I think that's great. We actually ran into some hurdles when we wanted to do some outdoor seating at Karma Cream, if you can believe that. And it was able to be, we found a way forward on it, and I think it's a great addition. So outdoor seating counting towards this is great. The only thing that I had a comment on was the idea of the screening wall height kind of being defined. I was worried that 4 feet just maybe a little too high if it was a solid wall. And then the word integral, screening wall that is integral and aligned with the front facade. In my mind, I started picturing this kind of solid portion of the wall just extending out. And that kind of got me worried that it was going to feel like this, 1980s like courtyard house. Because if you, when you travel and you go to urban places, anything with like active sidewalks, it's always usually really different. and it aligns with the building facade. Like, it looks like the materials, I like that it should be consistent with it. But I got worried that what that meant was, if you've got, a certain material on the wall of the building, that material then needs to form the screen wall. And so integral also, I was worried that meant that it had to physically connect to the building and couldn't just be aligned with it with kind of a gap. So I think it was just some specifics there that, I just wanted it to feel like they could have planters, they could have various materials. It could still potentially be open, not a solid wall, but something that kind of met all the, keep the food and alcohol inside the property requirements, but at the same time create a little more interest right at that edge. So I think that was the notes I had on that item.
Madam Chair, so I think some of those things are sort of what we were thinking, only because, well, I think they're good comments for sure. I think we were thinking that the wall would be, because this is going towards meeting like the building frontage, that we wanted something a little bit more substantial, like a wing wall or something that was attached to the primary facade. I think those are like, having gaps, I think makes sense. I don't think that was necessarily our intent, that it would be something that was like completely unbroken, especially if there is sort of pedestrian activity happening. What I would say about it, sort of generally speaking, is in our experience, like, we get a wide variety of what constitutes, like, oh yeah, you want a screen, you want a wall, like, no problem, like, you're right, choop, 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 choop. And typically, like, especially for more like corporate clients, they may have sort of a out of the box, like, no problem, like, what jurisdiction are you in, like, oh, need a thing, boom, there it is. And they're typically not super excited about deviating or coming up with something that's like, really unique and context specific, and like, they don't, that sometimes is a little bit of a harder sell. So anyway, so I would say, like, I think making tweaks to it, like, is we're good with that. Like, I wouldn't want to make it so sort of, flexible and nebulous, because I think then we as staff will be in a hard place trying to hold a line about what we sort of expect to see. I think honestly, this would be like maybe an area where having some graphics in the code would be helpful in describing sort of what we're talking about, versus necessarily trying to describe it in words. So I mean, even if it's just like pictures of examples of what we think is good and what we're trying to get, those would be helpful for both, probably for applicants, but also for staff to kind of, say this is what we're talking about, not, a 4-foot, chain link fence. So anyway, those are. Yeah, and I think if 4 feet is too tall, we can definitely go back. You go down to 3. I think we were just trying to.
Limiting it.
Yeah.
I think that's really smart.
Yeah.
Too. I was just concerned that if it had to get
Minimum.
So maybe we can. Yeah, maybe we can think about that a little bit, and maybe bring back some pictorial examples of something. And if the board has any like examples you want to send us, we'll be happy to like bring those forward. But I think that would be maybe a good addition to the code text, to have some examples of that.
Okay. Mr. Ackerman, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I feel like I'm doing Thomas's job tonight. I guess
Somebody's
that-
got to.
Somebody's got it.
I'm against it all. Actually, I understand we're talking about building frontages, but one of the issues that I've found, to me, self-defeating is this urge to fence in our outdoor seating areas as though they will escape, and before you know it, will be Paris. And so I'm not completely comfortable with the idea that we're going to make this thing an impenetrable barrier, particularly if we ever got to the kind of like Paris, where some of these outdoor seating areas would expand and contract during the day. They certainly do that in Italy, in Germany and France too, where, you know, during the day they actually have traffic going through there, and at night they expand out and put out umbrellas and do all this kind of stuff. And if you've got this impenetrable barrier, it makes it much more difficult. The second issue I have as you walk around downtown is that we have these fences that prevent you basically from walking down the sidewalk. And part of that's because we've made a special point of putting signs, trees, you know, poles, all kinds of things that, so it's like an obstacle, a slalom course to go down the street, and adding a fence just makes it all that much worse. So you figure it out. Actually, I would prefer that we do something that adds potentially some flexibility and also the ability to expand in a measured way if we ever got to the point where we were comfortable with people eating out in the street occasionally.
Yeah, I mean, I think Second Downtown is a good example. Crane Ramen and Bowl and all that. You know, all those have open railing systems with, you know, kind of a counter, and it feels like you are in this like realm of fluidity with like it's private, it's semi-private, it's public. And now that they've closed it down, I mean, I think it would be strange to have kind of a solid wall that was there. You know, one of the logistical things is literally when it rains and when it gets messy, like how does that come back out if it's got a solid base? So I think examples where people can, you know, if it makes sense and it should be solid, absolutely. If it makes sense for it to be a little more open and not create tripping hazards and slalom courses, I think, you know, that the examples to the designer would be great to see. Yeah. Just be like, oh, okay, I can kind of pick from these approved options.
I think that makes sense, and I would say like the city, like with some of the examples like downtown, those are even different than what we're talking about with this code provision. Like those are sidewalk cafes, and they have a whole separate set of regulations. And the board actually heard those a couple of years ago, where we removed requirements out of those standards for fencing in that very sort of same vein. The city's actually been talking about plans to have some of that fencing removed, and we're working sort of, you know, ad hoc right now with some of the downtown owners to have some of that fencing taken out and expand some of that seating out onto the sidewalk. What this is really kind of referring to is more outdoor seating areas on the private side, on private property. And I think, like, I see like a beautiful vision of like a really intentionally designed outdoor seating area, you know, for a project that is trying to like meet this building frontage standard. That doesn't necessarily have walls, but may have you know, ground treatments or, you know, plantings or some other sort of thing to delineate that this is an outdoor seating area. Similar to the last discussion, like the reality is what we'll probably see is like, oh yeah, this is my outdoor seating area. You know, it's like it's a berm, you know, or a sodded area, you know, that happens to be delineated on a site plan and has maybe a couple picnic tables put out there. And I think that's not necessarily what we're getting at, but I do think that there's maybe some flexibility or some flexibility we can either bake into the code language about this. You know, I'm sort of hesitant to make plans on something that's still in the works, but the reality is, like, some of these projects that may avail themselves of this provision of code will at some point in the near-ish future potentially be going to the development review board for review, and not being reviewed necessarily solely by my staff and other, you know, parts of the department. So there may be some way that we can provide some flexibility in the code language and provide that sort of call about the, you know, what it's gonna look like, and, you know, provide a little bit of flexibility to the board to make that decision potentially. So that's another option potentially to think about.
One thing that may like be an option is like having it be covered, because I don't see anything in here that requires it to be covered.
Mm-hmm.
Whether that's you know, a part of the building, you know, and it's a you know, pretty solid roof, or whether it's some kind of, you know, more decorative thing and it's got the sunshade, you know, tarps, but maybe that defines the space, and at least as an option, maybe where you aren't gonna have the screening wall, because I do feel like when we're counting the building frontage, and, you know, we did a project where we had to figure this out on
Right.
13th Street, and I think that roof line really helps define that
Right.
building.
Right.
And so I think adding something in here, at least for, maybe it's like the screening wall or the roof.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think having it covered, particularly if it's gonna be, you know, a seating area all the time, you know, where it's hot and it rains and everything else, it is a really good way to define the space as
Mhm.
well. So adding that in here, I'd like to see at least as an option, not that it'll happen everywhere, but on projects where we have sort of used this, I think that roof line makes the difference.
Yeah,
Even with a seating wall.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that makes sense. I think there's probably like when you detach that covering from the main roof line of the building, that's where I think we start to get into like, what is it like a, you know, do I go down to Home Depot and buy like a pergola set? You know, do I build like a, you know, a lean-to? You know, that's where things get. But I think when you attach it to the building, like it has to be, you know, it has to be engineered. It has to be, you know, have an architect doing it, and I think it makes it a little bit more intentional and integrated with the building. But I think that's a good suggestion as well that we can work into.
Would it be possible to go to the next page?
Yeah.
Building design standards, and begin on that. This one was just a question on A for building massing. The last sentence, the recesses and projections shall have a minimum depth and width of 10 feet. That's a potentially pretty big notch in the building. And I didn't know if that was beginning to, you know, conflict with the building frontage requirement. Like you're putting in this portion of the building that if it's beyond 60 feet, you have to put in a 10-foot minimum notch to it. So you've kind of already taken 1/6 of the building and removed that from your potential to be on the frontage. And so I just wanted to make sure that, I know that's not even up for debate, but I figured since we have it, I wanted to make sure that wasn't going to begin to create kind of an issue. I think 10 feet in an urban setting is a pretty big setback. I mean, if it was 5 feet, I would probably not have as much of a deal with it. But creating a 10-foot notch in a building is literally like, it's going to get super dirty in there. You're going to have to then
Why
like,
don't you make it go out?
Yeah.
or if you make it, you can make it go out too. So recesses and projections.
Yeah, you can make.
So
Which
they
could
go,
be
but
difficult
a
with
minimum
utilities
going
and-
out of 10 feet would be even maybe more difficult. So I just wanted to throw that out there, that may not actually be serving the purpose that it's intended to serve at the 10 feet. So just kind of something to think about.
Yeah, I think that I remember like way back when we were working on this code provision, there was some debate over like what's the right amount. 10 feet. I think there was I think we had at one point there was a draft I think that had like 3 feet, and I was like, well, that's not
Like
really,
not enough, yeah.
yeah, it's not enough, and like I think we landed on 10 feet primarily because it was it provided enough space potentially for a small landscaping feature, like a small understory tree that wasn't going to like obviously grow into the building, or to provide like some of that, because the space doesn't necessarily have to be just blank. I haven't heard like on projects that have been that have been permitted since then, that there's been a lot of like issue with it, but I mean,
And
yeah,
throw your
that's
transformer
all
in
to say
there.
that I think,
I'm thinking it's mostly in the dense area that we've been talking about
Yeah.
so often around here, less like a, you know, Celebration or Butler.
Right.
This is more like a downtown, urban, anything with a U in front of it.
right,
I think that's where I would just wanna make sure that, you know, that might not be the best thing for the project to have an automatic notch put in it.
Well, and it does provide for just that to be one option. So it also talks about like providing a tower or bay or an architecturally prominent public entrance.
Yes. And so, you know, honestly, if I was looking at that, I would probably just automatically go to the prominent.
Yeah.
Just be
Right.
like, okay, well, that's what you're, yeah.
You're never gonna get a break.
Yeah. So, and then, right, so it kind of, it's like, well, now you don't get the break that you want. So I didn't, just for food for thought. I don't have any action items on that. The next one is the big one, though. Okay, so if we don't mind jumping to the building materials section where there's a lot of blue, and I know this is still draft, so that's why I'm kind of voicing some of this now. What I'm generally concerned with is that even though it still seems like you're telling the design team and client and budget that you've got all these options in play, what's really, I'm concerned, is going to happen is that we are gonna be tasked with finding the cheapest option that is allowable, and you're gonna start to see that repeated on multiple buildings. So, you know, once the pricing comes back on whatever we wanna call it, let's just say it's brick, it's gonna start to be brick, 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 brick. Or if it's, in this case, cementitious siding, which is just hardy board.
that's pretty much only what we see these.
Oh, yeah. So that's what's gonna happen. It's gonna be at minimum 60%. There's nothing that says it can't be 100% that, I don't think. So my fear would be, let's take either of the hub buildings that are just made. And let's specifically take the one that's got the pretty nice, honestly, dark brick at the base. And then it transitions to a white upper for 6
King
stories.
Street one.
The one right on University, right by the McDonald's, that one. If you, in this example, said, hey, let's assume that was an EFS product and not like a direct applied, which again, I'm gonna go into, I think we need to define what that means. If you said, hey, you can only use that product on 10% of it, but I'm gonna just substitute hardy lap siding, because lap siding is gonna be your cheapest entry point for hardy. It's not gonna be the architectural large panels with the really neat reveals and all those things. That's like dollar. If you had a 6-story building that had nothing but hardy lap siding, I would make the argument that that would be worse than what, you know, is kind of there from a monolithic standpoint. So my concern is that this section, the moment we start kind of forcing some of this in, it may end up getting away from the ultimate goal, which is to have a diverse, you know, like the building should be designed for where they are, they should have local context, they should be durable, we all agree on that. But I think there's different ways to approach getting a durable material. And I would use the example of it. Most people are familiar with roof shingles, right? Asphalt shingles. Everybody knows the cheapest ones, what they look like. Everybody knows the architectural, you know, the 3 and 5 tab. You can specify, even in an EFS, like what that product, how many coats it has to have, the way that it has to be installed, that begins to be that you've got your entry-level flat shingle, and you've got your 5 tab, you know, 25-year architectural shingle. And so there's ways with each of these products to actually pick the like most durable use of that product, instead of saying you can't use it at all, where in some cases, if you, a well-maintained EFS is gonna be more energy efficient and may actually hold up longer than a poorly installed lap siding that would comply. So I would say one of my biggest things that I would want to help work with everybody on would be defining the categories in the spec, because I like that you're saying that it has to be submitted as part of the package, along with a maintenance schedule, which is usually going to tie to that manufacturer spec. So I think there's ways to give a bigger palette and incentivize people, because again, if you're saying, look, if you're going to use hardy, you can't use the thinnest hardy possible. You can't do that. You have to use like an upgraded hardy up to, you know, 40 feet or something, you know, or you have to treat each of the vertical joints differently than like the cheapest way of doing it would be. I think if you were going to get into this kind of specifics, I think you can demand that kind of specification be picked. The same way that you guys get into, you know, how much visibility glass has, it's the same exact thing you're doing here. You know, not allowing mirrored glass is the same as saying this is the way this other material has to be done. So I would encourage it to be more that, because I did have a chance to talk to some people in the design community that everybody, the first thing they said was, oh, that's awesome. You know, everybody wants a higher quality product. But, ooh, the more I thought about this, I already know what's going to happen. It's going to end up being the same over and over and over. So that's what I would be worried about. And then I would get into defining things like where it says durable, natural appearing, and then convincingly match. Like some of those, like those terms really need to have like a, what does that mean, you know? And then I would kind of be careful about saying a material is non-durable. You know, I would be worried that a product manufacturer would be like, what do you mean our product is not durable? Like you just generally called everything that we make like not durable. So I think I would be worried from like a municipal standpoint of like calling out somebody's product. No, I think you can, I know what you're saying here. Like we get it, you know, certain maintenance, certain thing, like everybody would agree, you know, the university campus has a lot of brick. Brick is one of the lowest maintenance, even though you do have to maintain brick, versus something that we all know is, you know, you have to, a dark color on paint is going to have to be painted every 2 years, 3 years maybe. So I think there's ways to do all of that in blue. I just wouldn't be ready to accept it as is.
Yeah, no, that's good feedback. I think we wanted to, I think from our, you know, some initial conversations we had, and from the last time we were before you guys, we talked a little bit about like durability in terms of maintenance.
Mm-hmm.
So we wanted to make sure that we're putting that sort of maintenance section in and and getting that with it. Yeah, I guess like I think that's good, and we can definitely maybe, you know, sit down and kind of work on it a little bit more. Like, you know, I do like this is like kind of minimum, and I think that ideally what we're trying to do is raise the bar, like raise the minimum standards, but not necessarily restrict the like what somebody could do in terms of like getting at the sort of intent, which is to you know, create attractive, long-lasting buildings and good cladding on those buildings.
So you may, one of the things that could happen would be kind of a flip this. So instead of saying, if I read this primary being the goal, I don't have to have an accent building material the way that I read it. So I would just go through and pick the cheapest primary material and probably just fire that at the whole building. Other than if you said it's not allowed on the first floor. And I think the first floor is really important. That's the most important floor, so you're right on track with that. I would just say if you wanted to group these almost into like categories, and if you really wanted to say, I don't want a monolithic building, say that you have to have a material from each category and figure out a way to put that on. Because if you're trying to give the design team a little bit of, you know, teeth in the game to say, hey, we want to make a better looking building, that would be one way, is to say you kind of mandating the minimum. Because the way that it reads now is, it's pretty open-ended. You know, you're not going to maybe tell somebody they can't do something that looks nice, but at the same time, you haven't really given it any teeth to look nice either.
Yeah, and I think you know, I've seen some examples from other places that set, you know, sort of you know, you have to have, you know, X amount of column A, X amount of column B, X amount of column C, and then there's also the sort of like the compliance. Okay, you know, I'm gonna, you know, stick some of that here, stick some of that here, stick some of that here, you know, because I'm meeting the code requirements, but it doesn't all sort of work together. And so but I like that idea, and I wonder if there's some or what the board thinks about like one of the sort of criticisms that we hear about modern sort of mid-rise, high-rise building design, specifically with cladding, is that they're sort of like, the worst sort of examples is like, you kind of load a bunch of material, even if it may be like the same material, just kind of treated differently or designed differently, like loaded it into a shotgun and like fired it at the facade, and you sort of have a hodgepodge of like maybe too many materials on it. Whereas I think the hub example, like it works pretty well because there's not too many materials on it, and that's a good example too. Is I think midway midway through the building permitting, there was like, they had brought forward a EFS material that like looked just like this other material, and like we can make it look exactly the same, and those are the types of things that, like, from the staff perspective, when we're like kind of reviewing these projects, having a little bit more guardrails on like what we're doing on design, short of, I guess, the other sort of really detailed sort of direction would be like a design review board, with like an architectural review board or something like that, which maybe a great thing, but we're just we're not really like talking about that at this point. So, but I think that's good, and yeah, if you don't mind, we're gonna lean on you some more.
Yeah. I reach out to the design community just to
Yeah.
make sure that we're all being represented. And
Yep.
not going up with all this, but that's what I saw.
Yeah.
And then I did have the last one under building entrances. This was one that we've all gone round and round about. Having the primary entrance on the street side where no one will ever be able to get to it. Those kind of projects. So the primary public entrance being oriented towards the public right of way, if it's in an area where the parking is going to be completely on the other side of the building, totally fine to have the idea of an entrance on the street, even if it's not functional. And we've run into this plenty, and I wish there was an easy answer for it, because you don't want to have it look like it's the back of the building.
Right.
You don't want that at all. But one of the new requirements in here that just kind of threw up a little bit of a red flag was that the primary public entrance, the way it's defined, in this case, if there was parking, not on the public way, and that's where people were coming in, I do want to make sure that they would not have to walk all the way around. Most likely what would be asked then would be to create a secondary entrance from the parking lot that would become the main entrance. The only thing that I would have a problem with is that you would then be creating this corridor that's going to have to go through potentially the middle of the building to connect the primary public entrances, having a direct access to building areas dedicated to ground floor active uses. So the trouble with that is that sometimes it would work just great to have that be, but sometimes it would then create a completely sacrificial entrance and amount of building area that would then just be kind of more common area factor for a lot of tenants to come in. So instead of trying to reduce that common area factor for multi-tenant buildings, in a single tenant building, it may not be as big of a deal. But I would be worried for multi-tenant, that extra common factor gets loaded onto every tenant that shares that kind of area. So I did just kind of want to ask about that one, having direct access to building areas dedicated to ground floor active uses.
Yeah, and I would say so the under the first or the number one, it basically this section is really talking about that every building has to have at least one primary public entrance. That doesn't preclude them to having other entrances, to the building. I think what the intent with 3 is really, with the providing access to the ground floor active uses that are mentioned in a separate section. That can be like ground floor retail space. That can be like lobby area. It can be amenity space, like in terms of recreational areas or fitness areas. but I think the idea is that we are trying to avoid like either a situation where you have like a building design where you have a sort of a primary entrance that is like going to like a gang hallway where all the interior units are where all the units are accessing interior.
Mhm.
It's just like a small kind of like, you know, entry door, maybe like a single sort of storefront system, as opposed to like having entrances, either like residential entrances that may go directly into the units if it's a small project,
Mhm.
or for like a larger project, like having those active ground floor uses, which we're already saying have to be on the primary facade of the building, and those can be like, you know, lobby, whatever, amenity spaces. That those have an access to the adjacent sidewalk. They have a door to the adjacent sidewalk.
Mhm.
I think it's like this is a sort of an existing standard in the code, but we're just trying to provide a little bit more clarity that we're really kind of we want that one primary entrance to access those active ground floor uses, but it doesn't preclude the building from having additional access points in other parts of the building, either through the parking or, you know, through other sides of the building.
Okay. That was it for me. Thank you.
Mr. Ackerman.
Just one comment. I mean, I hope we're keeping track of the ultimate goal here, which is to have an active street.
Right.
And that's the main thing, is you want to avoid having a wall basically that cuts off the street, the walking traffic from the building. And it strikes me that there's a whole bunch of ways you can do that. I mean, you know, the two hubs, both of them would be immeasurably improved if the retail was occupied. I mean, that would make a big difference. And I agree with Mr. Blythe that the key floor is the first floor. That's the floor that people experience as they walk around. Unless you're a gawker from Gainesville in New York, you're rarely ever looking up at the top of a building. And so the main thing you want to have is that engagement with the public realm, and you could do that in a whole bunch of different ways. I don't know if it necessarily needs a monumental door in every single building. I think just so long as the building is accessible to the public realm as people go by.
Mhm.
Yep.
Yeah, and I would agree with that that statement. I think I think the examples that of some of the single occupancy, like multifamily buildings that don't have ground floor retail is really, or any sort of ground floor space outside of just of units. That's really kind of, I think, where we have seen a couple of projects come through that we're trying to address. That yes, they have an entrance to the building, but it's not an entrance to the units, and so you lose that sort of street front life, and all of the units basically, yes, they're on the street or on the sidewalk, but their backs are basically to that, and then you end up with a very dead public space.
Right.
So I think we having ground floor, some of those ground floor units have direct access, can meet that standard, but I think we're trying to avoid the sort of situation where you yes, you have a door, but you're just sort of going right in that door, and it's, you know, and all the units are being accessed interior. So those are good comments. I think that's really kind of where we're trying to get to. But I think the exact examples of the hub with the ground floor retail, like those are like especially when it's empty. I 100% agree with that, because those spaces are just as dead as if it was, you know, a blank wall.
Walled off, yeah.
Commend you. It's not you and the team. It's not easy.
Yeah,
If it was easy, somebody would have figured it all out.
no, this is great. I mean, I love wonky code conversations. I think I appreciate the board's, working with us and trying to get to where we're trying to go.
So I think we gave you a lot to work on. Looks like Mr. Newman may have something else to add. No?
I was just gonna say, do we need to make a motion essentially for the staff to work on a little bit more, or do we?
Do you feel like you want a motion, or should we just?
No, I think we're
continue this
good.
item?
Yeah, I think we're good. Yeah, but
Okay.
we're trying to move some of these off of our code list, and so we'll try to do is maybe if we can, snag a little bit of your time, James, and we can kind of work on this and maybe see if we can bring it back to the next meeting if possible.
And Thomas will have a stab at it.
There you go. That's true too. And Sophia.
Oh, man, too bad we couldn't get it done before you got here.
Okay, so with that, we will see this at a future meeting next month or the following month. Ms. McMullen, can you read the next item into the record for us?
Yes. Next item is new business, petition PB-21-70 SEP, Gamble and Associates Construction, Inc., agent for Gainesville Christian Community School, James Schrader, owner. Request for a special use permit to allow the construction of a multi-purpose building and facilities expansion of an existing private school zoned residential single-family RSF1 located at 3536 Northwest 8th Avenue. And we have Nathaniel Chan on the line with us, who is going to give the staff presentation.
Great. Welcome, Mr. Chan.
Hi, good evening. Can you hear me all right?
We can hear you and see you. We'll let you know
Okay,
when
awesome.
your screen comes up.
Cool. I am testing my headphones, so just wanted to make sure you can hear me. All right, can you see my screen now?
Yes, it is up now.
Awesome. Well, good evening, Madam Chair and members of the City Plan Board. My name is Nathaniel Chan. I'm a planner for the City of Gainesville, Department of Sustainable Development. This is petition PB-21-70 SUP, a special use permit to allow for the construction of a multi-purpose building and facilities expansion for Gainesville Christian Community School. Mr. Schrader, the principal of GCCS, and a representative from Gamble and Associates Construction, I believe, are in the chambers tonight to answer questions. So this petition is privately initiated by Mr. Schrader and the Gamble and Associates Construction. The subject property, Gainesville Christian Community School, is located at 3536 Northwest 8th Avenue and has existing places of religious assembly and a private school. The current zoning is RSF1 and the current land use category is single family SF. The property is approximately 3.69 acres and the current special use permit, petition PB-16-71, allows the school use classification, defines the maximum number of students, hours of operation, and other conditions. The applicant is requesting a special use permit, again, to allow the construction of a multi-purpose building and facilities expansion of Building B. So Building B is this building right here on the east side of the property. This is Northwest 8th Avenue. This is Littlewood Elementary, and the surrounding zoning districts are all RSF1. The initial special use permit was approved back in August of 2000 with a minor development plan. So schools and daycare centers are permitted in RSF1 zoning district via special use permit, and the initial special use permit approved the school use on the property. There have been a couple of amendments since then. So in 2016, the special use permit was amended to increase the maximum number of students and daycare/after school children, and also adjusted the hours of operation. And so here we are today. The applicant is requesting a facilities expansion. Here is the preliminary development plan for, this is where the proposed building will be. The new building will replace building B1 through B10, which is referred to right here as the B wing. And so it will replace an existing playground, parking area, sidewalks and breezeways, and also some bike racks. So the vehicular parking will be replaced on the northern portion of the property, and bicycle parking will be relocated to the back of the proposed building. There will be no classification or use changes associated with this request, and there will not be an increase in the number of students or a change to the hours of operation at the school. And here are the preliminary floor plans. So as you can see, it's a gymnasium. There are classrooms and conference rooms. There's proposed bathroom facilities and an elevator. And the second floor has more conference and classrooms, bathroom facilities, and that's where the elevator is. With that being said, staff recommends approval of petition PB-21-70 SUP with conditions. The petition meets the review criteria for a special use permit outlined in section 30-3.24 of the Land Development Code. The existing private school is consistent with the comprehensive plan, the Land Development Code, and the surrounding land uses. The building's design will be reviewed at development plan review and building permit review to ensure compliance with the city's land development code and design guidelines, including frontage, setbacks, lighting, parking, and other design elements. More details on the petition meeting the review criteria can be found in the staff report. So here are the special use permit conditions. These conditions were carried over from the current SUP with a few amendments to the reference documents. So the only conditions that were amended were conditions 4, 5, and 6, which changed the reference documents from Exhibit C1 and D1 to the ones that I have, which are in Appendix E. And as I stated previously, the maximum number of students, hours of operation, and the use shall remain the same with no changes. With that, that's the end of my presentation. Staff also received an email in response to this petition. The email was in favor of the proposed gymnasium and facilities upgrade. The email was forwarded to you for your review. I'm here to answer any other questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chan. Are there any questions for staff on this application? Okay. Does the applicant have a presentation? I assume you all are here for this project? No? Okay, great, thank you. Okay. Is there anyone on the phone lines from the public for this item?
No, Madam Chair, there's nobody on the lines at this time.
Okay.
The floor is yours.
Great, we'll bring it back to the board for discussion or a motion then. Mr. Ackerman.
Madam Chair, I'm prepared to make a motion if there's no other discussion.
Doesn't look like there is.
I move that the city plan board approve, gotta be here somewhere, PB 21-0070 SUP, and that we make the required findings required in LDR section 30-3-24, together with the testimony we've heard here today, as well as the conditions outlined by staff.
Great, thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Mr. Newman. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Okay, passes unanimously. Great. And then we have one information item on the agenda, the Land Development Code updates. Mr. Persons or Ms. McMullen, I'm not sure who's
You
going to
can
go over
go.
that.
Sorry.
Yeah, you're free to go.
You don't have to stay and listen to the rest of this.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for being here.
I know, I'm so sorry.
See, do we have to listen to all of it?
So the document we provided for this update, it's basically, it's an update of the document that we provided to you before with just the status of where all of the items are for the code amendments. So some things to note from the list, the neighborhood workshop / notification process issue, well, that's actually grown into a larger issue, to consider development review as a whole, and sort of what processes should be done for that. So the city commission is still discussing that item. They had a meeting on it either last week or the week before, and they moved forward with a recommendation to approve the proposed changes to the neighborhood workshop and public notice section, as well as requiring major and intermediate development plans to go before the Development Review Board for approval. So the first reading of the ordinance has not been scheduled for that yet. They did ask for staff to bring back some additional information. So it's not set in stone, you know, what exactly is going to happen with that yet. There may be some potential revisions to the thresholds for intermediate development plans. They expressed some interest in looking at sort of defining different thresholds for that, since that category covers such a large, you know, number of things. So, for example, for residential, I believe that starts at either 10 or 11 units and goes up to 99 units. So they had some concerns about requiring Development Review Board review for, you know, some of the smaller projects. So they're still discussing that. First reading of the ordinance has not been scheduled yet. So that's the status update on that one. And then...
Can I ask one question
Sure.
on that? And I know I've already talked to you guys about this, but keeping neighborhood meetings virtual was a part of that whole process
Yes.
as well. And that, there wasn't any discussion of like, even though board meetings, they're sort of leaning towards everything having to come back in person, they didn't discuss making neighborhood meetings in person again.
They didn't
Okay.
discuss it. Really, the only thing they discussed at the last meeting was the levels of development review.
Yes.
And, you know, one of the other proposed changes was removing the requirement for newspaper advertisements, which is still in the language. So, but, you know, they'll talk about it again at first reading whenever that's scheduled.
Okay.
I have a question. We're talking about adding board review for intermediate and fairly small developments that have met the requirements of the code. What would be the basis of saying no?
Well, I guess without getting too far.
I hate to ask questions that nobody wants to hear.
Yeah, no. Without getting too far into it, I guess what staff explained during that hearing was that the whether it is reviewed by staff, and I say staff sort of writ large, not just like my staff, but other departments, whether it's staff or a board like the plan board or the DRB, the standards are the same. Like these are, especially for development plan review, those are just, you know, basically administrative application of existing adopted review standards. So those things don't change whether it's me or whether it's a board reviewing them. My impression from the discussion from the commission was that there is a desire from the commission to have a more sort of public process or a more
For things that are administratively reviewed.
right.
Okay, so this is really tied to things that are administratively reviewed.
Right, and essentially unless there's a request for a variance or special use permit or some other sort of review, everything right now is being reviewed administratively by the city.
Okay. So all of our efforts to streamline the process has just been undone.
Well, and I would say from my
And
my
make housing more affordable. Yeah.
right, from
Yeah.
my point,
Exactly.
from a staff perspective, I'm we're not sort of weighing in on the merits sort of either way of that so much as like there's obviously going to be impacts to my staff and the work that we do, because part of I think making a more transparent process or having that sort of aspect and trying to meet the goals of the commission is going to be, staff generating staff reports and presentations, administering like a board. And those are things that don't sort of happen magically. They happen with the hard work of Ms. McMullen and Ms. Shazule and all of the staff that are involved in that. So that's my only sort of concern, is that if there's not sort of a corresponding like resource allocation, then we're just, we're either gonna start burning staff out, or we're just, some other things are gonna have to fall off the wagon, so.
Okay.
So, and I realize this is out of our hands at this point, but there are other models for this. Like, it's fairly common for site plans to go to a staff committee for final review. I mean, the county does it. You go to DRC for most things, and it's 3 county staff people that aren't involved in the development review. So it's a little bit more streamlined. You're still getting a public hearing, if you will, but it's a little bit more, I don't know that like controlled is the right word, but it's a little bit different. And it's it's very common across the state. I mean, I go to DRCs and TRCs all over the place.
Yeah, I've worked in jurisdictions. that
Yeah,
do that.
so
Me too.
I don't know if that's something that they have considered. If it's really a matter of having a public hearing, I don't know that like loading up volunteers to stay until 11 o'clock because you've got 25 development plans. I mean, you all are loaded right now.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think just thinking about the numbers, I mean, how many intermediate and major development plans are you approving in a month?
That's what we're gonna be bringing back some
So,
of this in.
That's just a lot to put on a volunteer board in addition to your staff.
Right.
I mean, we've done plenty of midnight meetings, but,
Our best work is not done at midnight.
yeah. So I worry about that being the model. I understand the concern about wanting, the opportunity for the public. I think there's other ways to get to that without a public hearing. I think, technology is there that people can give input without attending a public hearing. I think making public hearings, exclusively in person and making people come to this room, which is where they're leaning, is going to actually decrease some of that engagement. So, it's contrary. A lot of what they're doing is contrary to what they're saying. But considering a staff board might be worthwhile, maybe even just for the intermediate ones, whatever that threshold ends up looking like. I mean, I get it. These major development plans, you're talking about more than 100 units, you're talking about, big amounts of square footage. Maybe that should go to the DRB, but for the intermediate ones, I don't think they realize how many of those site plans you all are processing right now.
Mhm.
Well, more importantly.
When you're going to that board, it adds 2 months. It's not just adding a month, it's adding 2
Yeah.
months to the
Potentially
process,
more.
and there's cost, and
That's my.
it defeats everything that they're saying about wanting affordable housing.
Yeah.
I mean, it completely is contrary, and I don't agree. I don't agree at all, and the evidence shows that. Like, adding time and process increases cost, and developers don't pay that. Renters and homeowners pay that. It gets passed along in the system. So if you want affordable housing, it's not the way to go. Bottom line.
Ditto, I agree. To me, that's the problem with this concept is the very people who are interested in affordable housing are trying to load up costs on it.
And it's not just this.
That makes
but-
no sense.
And from my standpoint, I just want to make sure whatever decision.
You don't have to.
You don't have to express
I just
your
want to
personal
make sure
opinion.
whatever it is that we're doing it, we're doing it correctly. We're doing a good job. That's then making sure we have the people to be able to do that. So.
They cut off my salary a long time ago.
And the code requirements are there, and if there's something that people are concerned about not being addressed appropriately in code, that can be handled through code amendments. It doesn't have to be handled by every project going to the DRB. There's other, if there's something you're concerned about, you can address it through code amendments, and the staff will implement that. But I think it's worth, if they're dead set on some kind of public hearing, considering a staff board for review. It works well all over the state, all over the country. I don't think they're headed in the right direction to get housing more affordable in this city.
And I would say, I guess there were a number of other sort of items that they wanted, some other data points that they wanted us to bring back so they could consider, so I don't necessarily think that the like die as set necessarily with like sort of one idea. I think there may be like I think there's still room to like bring up some other kind of ideas that I think try to get at what the commission's interest is. So.
It was not necessarily, I didn't come out of that meeting thinking like definitely they're going to require intermediate at the way it's currently set up with those thresholds to go to the DRB, but I think they wanted more information from us, and one thing I want to bring back is the number of plans and things like that. So yeah, we will try to keep you updated on that as the conversation goes along.
Great.
And yeah, and you have the list of other updated items. I'm not sure if there was anything else in particular that Andrew wanted to mention from that list, or if you had any questions on any items on that list.
I think we also tried to capture some of the items that the board added to the list, since that. So there were a number of things I think when we went back to the commission with the list, not too long ago at the joint meeting they added. So those are there as well.
Do you feel like the ones that we sort of got punted to the comp plan items, do you feel like those are being addressed adequately as part of that process? Even the like map amendment piece, because I know the focus on the comp plan is, on equity,
right.
and so I worry that like if we're referring a map amendment idea, like is that being handled or is it kind of lost in, because I haven't seen, I've seen these like big picture policy
right.
stuff, and so I want to be sure things that we've punted to the comp plan are actually going to be handled there, and we don't need to look at them separately.
Yeah, I think that's good feedback. I think maybe what we will want to do is clarify that that item that it's not going to be handled with the comp plan, but maybe better to take up after the comp plan's been adopted, so we have understand where the landscape is from that point.
Okay, and then my other question is where the study on inclusionary and exclusionary zoning stands, and how much of that is just being rolled into the comp plan versus are we going to see the results of what the consultant's doing at some point?
Yes, and no and yes. No in that it is not being, it's a separate process from the comprehensive plan work, so that's going to be something that is sort of separate from that. There may be not completely separate, I should say, because we have a housing chapter, in the comprehensive plan, and that'll sort of identify that, along with the housing action plan that the commission approved last year, that has sort of high level strategy. That'll be in the comprehensive plan, but the primary focus of the exclusionary and inclusionary study will be identifying code provisions in the land development code, provisions that have an exclusionary effect, and those will absolutely come before you long before will come before you, obviously, before we're bringing code amendments forward with this, and then the inclusionary part is pretty standalone as well. So yeah, I just actually met with the consultant today and that's still really initial at this. We're so early stage in identifying some of the major sort of frameworks of the analysis. They haven't actually started the analysis, and we'll be having some commission conversations pretty soon. But I think what we could do is bring them before that group, because they're a separate group. Bring those before the plan board at a meeting, so they can get some feedback from you all.
Great.
I get one thing that might be helpful is, maybe sort of organizing this list a little bit differently. So for example, if things are getting the comp plan, that we just kind of move that into a section or another leg table, and then we kind of reorder the things that are there. And I don't know, well, we're not going to probably have another meeting, but it's been a year and a half, whatever, since we did this long. It's pre-COVID. So, I mean, is the ranking, the order still applicable? I mean, should things be prioritized? Should we or someone look and reprioritize these things? So, those are my two thoughts.
Yeah, I think that was sort of an intent with the joint meeting that we had with you all. I think there was some prioritization that we received from the commission on some of the items that they wanted sort of moved up the list. That were things that once we had sort of knocked off some of the items from the initial list, they wanted to sort of bumped up, and so that's sort of where we are right now, I think, with that.
Yeah, I agree. It might be helpful to sort of have them sorted like what's done, what's in progress, what's the comp plan, and what's like other pending. You know, you could leave the numbers in it somewhere, but I agree that would help to have it sorted that way.
Yeah, I think the numbers probably don't have a lot of bearing anymore because those were done like a long time ago. So I think having maybe more just general like high priority, medium, low, you know, or high, highest, even higher.
Yes.
Right.
Great. Any other comments on this list from board members? I think there was something we wanted to add last month. I don't even remember
They
what it
added it.
was.
They
Is
added
it
it.
on here?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
I don't remember
I
what
think
it
we
was.
tried to capture everything that.
Okay.
the list.
Perfect. Any other member comments this evening? Okay, not seeing any. Our next meeting date is July 22nd. And we will adjourn for now and see you all then.